Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this week's special episode of the Digital Law Podcast, brought to you by Digital Law and produced by Anson Evaluate. As a bit of background, we at Digital Law are a niche law firm specialising in working solely in the technology and cybersecurity law sector. In each episode, we look at recent stories in the news relating to digital technology from around the world, with a specific emphasis on data protection and cybersecurity. So for more information about the story that we are covering this week, please check the link in our show notes. But firstly, by way of an introduction, I'm Amelia Davies, an apprentice solicitor at Digital Law UK, and I'm joined by Peter Wright, and I'll let Peter introduce himself before we get started.
My name's Peter, I'm a solicitor, I'm the Managing Director of Digital Law, and looking forward to taking you through our special subject today, which is we have a new law to look at. And this one only took 2 years to actually get onto the statute book. So this is like moving at light speed when it comes to legislation. So I will pass back to Amelia to kick us off.
Thanks, Peter. So before I reveal this elusive law that we're going to be talking about, first, just a bit of background information about our podcast producer, Anson Evaluate. Anson Evaluate are a consultancy company offering a variety of services, including data protection training, outsourced data protection officer services, and specialising in advising clients over multiple jurisdictions. And so, I won't make you hold your breath any longer. We today will be covering Data Use and Access Acts. So most of you might be thinking, oh crikey, what is this? So the Data Use and Access Act is an act that amends the following UK laws. So that would be the UK General Data Protection Regulation, so GDPR, the Data Protection Act 2018, and PECA, the Privacy and Electronic Communication Regulations. Now that's quite a mouthful there, but the Data Use and Access Act essentially fills the gaps in data protection and also the gaps that the Digital Information Bill that was sort of left behind in 2023 with Conservative government being replaced by Labour. Peter, I'll let you fill in some more context on that.
So I think the thing to remember on this is that actually this piece of legislation has had a really difficult gestation, shall we say. So as you quite rightly identified there, Amelia, this was originally a piece of legislation that was brought in by the Sunak government in the last Parliament. So we remember this being announced in it was the King's speech.
I believe so.
So I think it was the first one he gave actually in his own right, King Charles III. And he announced that this bill was going to happen, and then it didn't make its way through Parliament before it's difficult to remember now, but of course the last general election was very much a snap general election. We didn't think we were going to get it in July of 2024, which meant that suddenly in May, a load of things were what they call guillotined because they didn't make their way through Parliament before suddenly that's it, clear the decks, nothing else, and everyone, all the MPs then become candidates for election, and that's it. Parliament can't do anything. So this was one piece of legislation that was a casualty of that process. And it hadn't really got particularly far in that time because clearly they thought, well, we've got more time to do this. The election wasn't expected really until the autumn. So what we then get is the new government coming in, Keir Starmer's government, and they've sort of picked it up, but kind of lopped off from it some of the more difficult, more idealistic bits of reforms that were in that original bill as it was drafted. Some had fallen by the wayside during the legislative process anyway, so subject to amendments and changes in committee. And they also tried to add a few bits on. So while this bill has made its way back and forth between then the Commons and the House of Lords, the main bit that received any publicity outside of Parliament was mainly about copyright, because there was a bit of a dispute regarding the copyright of content creators, in particular music artists.
You had the likes of, I believe it was Dua Lipa and Sir Elton John, all of which getting behind this and kind of saying, well, we actually need this to be included to protect ourselves.
Yes, and then you had others saying, well, no, you can't do this because then it will stop innovation by AI in the UK, and you'll make the UK less competitive, and all this stuff, arguments back and forth. And clearly the government thought, this is way too difficult, and then has decided to cut that piece out a bit as well. So what we're left with is quite a sort of dry procedural piece of legislation that kind of looks at various things in terms of how Data Protection Act 2018 was operating, and takes some bits of ICO guidance and puts them on the face of the act. So it's now law rather than just, on the ICO website it tells you to do this.
Yeah.
It ties up a few things from a regulatory perspective. It draws together the powers that the ICO has, and even renames the ICO, and we'll come to that. But the point is, it's more of a sort of little bit of housekeeping. There's not really anything particularly earth-shattering in there. But the reason we wanted to put together this summary for everyone now is because you add it all together, and there's actually is quite a lot in there.
Oh, absolutely.
So hence we thought we'll discuss this with you all now. We're doing a summary of this for our clients. If you wanted a copy of that written summary, get in touch with us. We will probably be putting sort of links to this out via social media as well. But if you are following how data protection law is evolving in the UK, this is actually really important. And in particular, it is important when you think that the UK continues to be subject to an adequacy decision from the European Union.
Yes.
And they've already said that the renewal date for that review of adequacy, which we knew was coming up in 2025, has now been put back by 6 months, hasn't it? While they sort of bed in and watch how this develops.
No, that's just it. They've literally pushed it back because they just want to see what happens. And as we see from the European Data Protection Board, they do like to watch what is going on. And what their verdict will be, who knows? I mean, based on these changes, like you said, they're not specifically radical. They are just tying up a lot of loose ends, but can be finicky when it comes to thinking about the specific details that are included. So it's a matter of watch this space in relation to the UK's decision on adequacy with the EU.
And I think as well, it's also a fairly big line in the sand when, Amelia, you and I are used to speaking to people who will just start talking to us about, you do data protection, you mean GDPR, and start banging on about that, which we'll usually quietly say, well, it's actually the UK Data Protection Act 2018 and in turn the UK's GDPR.
Yeah.
People think, it's pedantry. Well, no, it isn't, because the way it's being regulated and enforced in the UK has been diverging now, and it's been diverging, since the UK left the European Union, and this bill increases that divergence.
Yeah.
So when you're thinking, UK versus EU GDPR, this is merely making that difference bigger now, if anything. So it actually is even more important when it comes to how the UK does its business with Europe and vice versa. So let's start going through the detail, really.
Yes. So firstly, thinking about what does the Data Use and Access Act do? So firstly, considering maybe the more headline business impacting changes. Firstly, we've got automated decision making. So the DUAA, so the Data Use and Access Act, it's a nice mouthful, essentially amends the use of AI and automated decision making by relaxing the requirements for individual consent, where it's provided the appropriate safeguards are in place. This potentially includes allowing you to rely on legitimate interest as a lawful basis for AI and the use of automated decision making. So before now, this was only specifically in relation to, I believe it was consent and contract. Forgive me if I'm wrong there. But this then broadens that out. But of course, there is that kind of but in there where it says you do have to continue to have those appropriate safeguards. So you're looking at a balance between protecting individuals' rights, promoting fairness, but also, try to move things on, because we have seen a massive influx of the use of AI. And clearly, kind of within this, the regulator is saying that, and lawmakers are saying that this needs to be kind of relaxed, and that it does need to be used to make sure that we are, well, for a start, regulating it, but also using it to the best of the ability to promote innovation. And that doesn't mean to say that it's not, again, think about those safeguards, that human intervention is not going to happen. We are still going to have that element of, okay, a real person has taken a look at this, but it's just that relaxation, which I think is going to be really useful.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when we think how much the use of AI has evolved and changed since certainly GDPR came in, and certainly since the Data Protection Act of 2018. This is now reflecting the fact that automated decision making is simply a far more common and ubiquitous thing in our everyday lives.
Absolutely.
We're coming up against algorithms every time you make an inquiry to a call center. How do you think the call's being handled then? It's AI. Every time you switch on Netflix and it suggests to you what movies to watch, guess how it's doing that? AI. So there's that element of automated decision making now that we might not necessarily know it, but it's there and it is influencing the choices and how we are living our lives every day. And this is therefore turning around and trying to reflect that, saying, if anything, we're actually removing to a certain extent some of the roadblocks in the way of that happening, but then tightening it up in terms of actually saying that automated decision making when it comes to special category data is more restricted.
Yes, you just moved on to the point that I was about to make. So obviously this is in relation to what I call general personal data. This does not apply to special category data, so that's thinking about health-related data, ethnicity-related data, and a whole other sort of higher category of data, because that's where you're going to be looking at there's going to be a higher risk to the individual if then you're using automated decision making. I think we've discussed the case before on an earlier episode of the podcast where Facebook had a few issues with their automation decision making and biases, and we won't go too far down that rabbit hole, but certainly when you are considering special category data, it is far easier to come to certain decisions about groups of people that may have special categories of data, special categories. And that's why this is going to be continued to be restricted, and doesn't seem that they're going to be loosening their grip on that one.
Indeed.
Moving on to legitimate interests. So data controllers will be exempt from conducting a full legitimate interest assessment, otherwise known as an LIA, when processing personal data for specific purposes such as national security, emergency response, and safeguarding. And again, this is another one of those where it's a small change, but it certainly feels like a step in the right direction. Peter, I'll let you go through this in some more detail.
It does. I'm sure a few of our clients would wish that they were also freed from the need to carry out a full legitimate interest assessment. Unfortunately, none of our clients are in the national security or emergency response field. But the fact that it's saying that, look, when it comes to issues around security and emergency services and response, you can see why not encumbering them with the needs to necessarily carry out a full assessment does kind of make sense. Though interestingly, the fact that it actually suggests an element of relaxation there, an exemption when it comes to safeguarding, I find quite interesting, because of course we're usually looking at that in the context of, minors, vulnerable individuals, etc. So a little surprised that that's there, though I suspect it could well be that the sheer volume of safeguarding undertaken from organisations, from education to healthcare to social care, mean that perhaps it's becoming such a burden on those public sectors that they've said, well, let's actually see if, we know therefore that if you are dealing with safeguarding, that you have to make sure that data is being looked after carefully, and that therefore the need to carry out an LIA is perhaps less crucial.
Thanks, Peter. Moving on to probably one of the biggest kind of topics if we're thinking about businesses, and we're looking at subject access requests. And I do apologise if it sent a shiver down your spine there. No one likes to hear about those. So the Data Use and Access Bill makes it clear that you only have to make reasonable and proportionate searches when someone asks for access to their personal information and what you hold on them. And this has actually been something that's been coming up with our clients quite recently in terms of looking at what is reasonable and proportionate when responding to a DSAR. Peter, do you want to go into some more detail on that?
Yeah, well, I should add at this point that most of what's in here actually just reflects existing guidance that the ICO had issued over the course of the last 5 years or more, in terms of how they think organisations should be carrying out a DSAR anyway. The point is that now it's saying, well, this is actually no longer just the status of guidance on the ICO website and, the word at one point from Jonathan Edwards. It's now making it clear that, well, no, this is actually on the face of the bill, it is on the act, it's become law. So it's basically just taking what you should have been doing and now saying it's now the law of England and Wales and you should be doing it. If you aren't doing it, then that means that the ICO can turn around and carry out enforcement. So it's a lot more straightforward for the ICO to therefore sort of flex their muscles in that regard. So that's why we then get a raft of requirements here. One is to talk about reasonable proportionate searches, and making it clear you only have to make a reasonable proportionate search when someone asks for access to their data. So going to the nth degree and it costing an organisation hundreds or thousands of pounds to carry out that search would not be reasonable and proportionate, for example. It places an obligation on organisations and competent authorities to help people make complaints. And I mean, data subjects very often do want to complain if they think it's taking longer than the statutory timeframes, whereby ordinarily it should be 30 days unless it's made clear by the organisation, by the controller, we're going to take longer to do this, and they make that clear to the data subject. I think that's where very often there's a lot of ambiguity and where data subjects get annoyed. So the point is they should be able to make a complaint more easily. Complaints should be acknowledged within 30 days. Then there should be the element of when organisations do withhold information and they apply an exemption, you can't just put a black box on it and say, oh, we're redacting that. Why are you making that redaction? Under what exemption are you doing that? Is it, for example, client confidentiality? Is it legal professional privilege? What are the reasons why that black box is being applied? And we have advised a number of data subjects on this where they'll say, why is all this information redacted? And it's not particularly clear why that is the case. So while the guidance, again, on the ICO site is that organisations should be telling data subjects, this is why this has been redacted and this is how we're applying the exemption. Now it's saying on the face of the bill, this is what you have to do. And I think that's actually a really positive thing because hopefully it'll be more understandable.
Well, yeah, it just makes it more transparent, doesn't it? And if you're being more transparent, then the hope is you're not going to get these poxy complaints. And, then you're not spending more time doing it. It just becomes a more efficient process. Because as well, the data subject gains a new right to actually request that the ICO reviews how exemptions have been applied to their case. So if they're that jarred off, that they can actually go to the regulator and, yes, I feel like I know what you're going to say, but I'll let you say it anyway.
Well, and unfortunately, like many arms of the British state at the moment, on our last count, it's taking, if you contact the ICO, it takes about 6 months for them to come back to you. So the idea of, oh yes, you now have the right to request a review from the ICO, it's like, someone will come back to you within the year. I almost wonder there if Parliament hasn't thought carefully about that, because if anything, you're just adding to the burden on the ICO. And I can't see that backlog or those sorts of reviews being handled swiftly happening anytime soon.
No. But that's a problem for the ICO, but that's just another right that as a data subject that you have, and whether you want to exercise it and go through that long response process, that is up to you. But at least it's there.
Indeed.
Moving on to then the next update, looking at recognised legitimate interests. So the Data Use and Access Act sets out a limited number of processing activities for which recognised legitimate interest is a lawful basis. So organisations that can rely on legitimate interest do not then need to prepare a legitimate interest assessment. So again, going back to the LIAs. The Act also lists certain processing activities which may be a legitimate interest, and that includes intragroup sharing and direct marketing. So these organisations must continue to prepare an LIA for the processing, but the Act provides additional guidance on the types of processing that may be acceptable. So again, we're looking at more of a, not an over sort of completely getting rid of things, and we're not getting rid of the LIAs, but certainly making them more relaxed under certain circumstances. And I think, again, that's very useful when we are thinking about kind of the pressure that organisations are under.
Yes. So that the idea here is that, increasingly organisations are trying to argue that their processing is carried out on the basis of legitimate interest. Funnily enough, we tend to try and help our clients to be able to use contract more often than not, because I think it's a much neater and comprehensive way of doing it, and it's all nicely confirmed in writing as well. But for a lot of organisations, unless you want to start dealing with consent, which specific informed consent is a pain to process and update anyway, you then end up coming down to, let's carry out an LIA, and this can be increasingly onerous to sort of jump through all of those hoops. So there is the element here to sort of talk about recognised legitimate interest as a lawful basis, and to talk about certain activities that could be more easily construed as being as a legitimate interest. So, they talk here about intra-group sharing and direct marketing, interestingly, as well. And I think very often there is a considerable overlap between the use of personal data for direct marketing and the privacy and electronic communications regulations as well. And we'll be coming later on to some key updates with regards to those regulations, which are actually contained in this bill as well. But the point is it's trying to tidy up the increasingly broad use of legitimate interest with some clearer definitions within this act, which hopefully will help steer the use of legitimate interest as a legitimate basis of processing going forward.
Thanks, Peter. So looking at our next update, we're looking at purpose limitation. So the concept of further processing has been clarified under the Act, establishing criteria to determine whether the further processing aligns with the original purpose, whilst considering factors such as the relationship between the new and the original purpose, and the context of the initial data collection, as well as thinking about the potential impacts on the data subjects. So again, we're seeing that common theme of relaxation of the rules here. Because, if you can make that clear link, then they're saying, well, actually, you could say that it falls under further processing.
Yes, and I think that's just it. This, again, is trying to reflect how data is used by businesses in this decade, which wasn't necessarily something you could envisage in terms of the sheer volume of it and how that data would be exchanged. And used and modelled in future. So there's issues here in terms of what purpose was data originally collected for? Can you stretch that to what you're now wanting to use it for? And indeed, they're then saying, well, if that's the case, what is the potential impact on the data subject from how you're looking to use it? So I think this is to try and suggest that further processing can be carried out, but if, for example, there will be a negative impact on the data subject where, for example, that data might be at greater risk of being hacked or compromised, or would that data become inaccurate and lead to them receiving offers, marketing that was no longer relevant or wanted for, or indeed could it just lead to them receiving vast, insane quantities of spam, even more than they already do? It's those sorts of things they're thinking about here. But arguably then if that impact is comparatively low, it's saying, well, therefore you can potentially look at how that data is being used. And so it's trying to cover a slightly more innovative use of data.
Yeah.
And indeed the longer retention and use of data that we're now getting, very often because data is being gathered in such volumes and in such ways that simply could not have been easily envisaged when the laws from the last decade were being drafted.
Yeah, and not to mention as well, if we're thinking back to 2018 when the Data Protection Act finally did kind of come to force, that's not to think the fact that when that originally started, that was many, many years where they were going back and forth and debating what was actually going to be in there.
Exactly.
So if we think about truly how perhaps out of date the Data Protection Act is, we're covering a far broader stretch of changing circumstances.
Exactly. Bear in mind that UK Data Protection Act was based on GDPR. The first edition of GDPR was published in 2012.
Over 10 years ago.
And then when it was passed into law by the European Parliament, that was 2016.
And that's also almost 10 years ago.
Yeah. So, and this is just it. While it was designed to be future-proof, good luck trying to design anything to be future-proof when you're talking about digital technology. I don't think, for example, they could have seen even how things like blockchain and cryptocurrency would evolve, let alone how now AI and increasingly generative AI are harvesting data, using it, modeling it, models being trained on said data.
Yeah.
These are the sorts of things that I don't think those legislators could have, put it bluntly, I don't think they could have really comprehended or catered for that.
No, definitely not.
This attempts to address that.
Moving next on to international data transfers. So in the UK, there will be a new approach to the test for adequacy applied by the government to countries and international organisations when data controllers are carrying out a transfer impact assessment. The threshold for this new data protection test will be whether a jurisdiction offers protection that is not materially lower than under the UK GDPR and the Data Protection Act. This is quite interesting because, Peter, we both have sort of slightly different initial takes. Peter, I'll let you discuss yours and I'll kind of go through my reading of it.
It's funny, when I still hear the phrase data adequacy, it does take me back to the days of pre-Brexit, where we were thinking about this stuff, and I ended up speaking at so many conferences and events, even an event in Brussels with members of the European Commission who were there, and they were sort of nodding and listening about what I was saying about data adequacy, and I'm thinking, okay, I expected to be hearing from you on this, but if you're hearing from me, there we go. But the point is that adequacy became a big deal for the UK when it left the European Union. And increasingly now the UK is signing trade deals around the world. So this year we've already had the updated deal with the European Union. We've got the deal with the United States, and also the deal with India, as well as other deals that have been signed with countries from Canada, Japan, etc. Now, I mention those trade deals because I think the regulator having the power to turn around and then say, well, we will grant an adequacy decision in terms of the transporting of data of UK citizens to that third country, and saying that's adequate, then facilitates the trade that you're trying to facilitate using that trade deal.
Yes.
So you can see why that makes sense to more broadly talk about this data protection test. So it's a good bit of tidying up from that point, because obviously the ICO is having to make more of these sorts of adequacy decisions in the world that we now find ourselves in. However, this talks about the data protection test being whether a jurisdiction offers protection that is not materially lower than UK GDPR. But of course, it's not just going to be a matter of looking at data protection legislation in a third country and saying, oh, that's close to GDPR, that means it's fine. Any test has then got to look at, more broadly, things like the rule of law in any third country. It's got to look at the things like the powers of the state when it comes to investigatory powers and bulk surveillance and security laws, in order to then be able to gauge, well, how secure is third-party personal data if we send it to said third country. So there is a lot to consider when it comes to an adequacy decision, but this is trying to sort of tie all of those things together, because, as I say, when we're increasingly negotiating with countries and wanting to talk about trade, this means that this is one of the things to do. However, this, I think, also is one of the reasons why the European Commission is then flagging up and thinking, well, hang on, we're worried about our European Commission adequacy decision to the UK. If it turns out you're sending personal data from the UK to third countries that we don't think are sufficiently adequate in terms of their data protection laws and security. So there is that sort of catch-22 there, and I think this is one of the reasons why the European Union is therefore saying, well, we'll reserve judgment on whether we're going to continue adequacy within the UK until we see the proof is being in the pudding of how you're going to use your own data adequacy law in terms of who you're going to authorise. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think one thing you've obviously talked about trade deals, but the other thing is, obviously, we are now in this era where data and digital information is almost a currency at this point. This is the money maker. This is why Meta like to collect more data. But there's also the fact that now people are recognising this. You've got other countries that initially didn't necessarily have the necessary legislation to protect against data protection that are now kind of coming to fruition. So this then gives the UK the ability to say, okay, well, we now recognise the fact you guys are putting into effort. You've got legislation, you're actually making sure that it is enforced, and you're doing X, Y, and Z. Yeah. You've then got the ability to open up more doors. You've got innovation. And I think that's what a lot of, in the last couple of years, government's been talking about. They've been saying, well, we want to foster innovation. I think this is sort of loosely what it's getting at.
Yeah. It's an attempt. Absolutely.
Moving then on to our next update, we're looking at fines under the Privacy and Electronic Communication Regulations, also known as PECA. Essentially, the fines have been increased. Organisations that conduct business-to-consumer electronic direct marketing should note that the potential fines for infringing PECA will increase from the current ceiling of £500,000 to 4% of global annual turnover, or £17.5 million, to align with the sanctions regime under UK GDPR. And Peter, you mentioned this like straight off the bat. You said, well, actually, a lot of the ICO's work does fall under PECA.
Yeah.
And so if you're then increasing these fines, it really tells organisations to pull their socks up when they're looking at their marketing activities.
Indeed. So when you look at on the ICO's website, what have you been doing? Well, and you sort of look at recent enforcement.
Yeah.
We're always looking for these sort of juicy data protection breaches and, who's been hacked and what enforcement have you got? Because that's, for us, that's the jurisprudence. That's almost the case law in terms of how they're regulating and enforcing GDPR. But when you go on there, the vast majority of that enforcement isn't Data Protection Act. It's PECA. And it's direct marketing.
The public has been sent 99,000, cold calls that didn't want me to ask for, and therefore they've been on the receiving end of the ICO's enforcement.
Cold calls, faxes, as used to be, spam email, SMS. And the thing is that, of course, why is the ICO spending a lot of time working on this stuff? Well, that's the thing that to the public, they'll end up getting hundreds of complaints from people saying, I'm receiving, being carpet bombed with all of these SMS messages or all these emails. Will you do something about it? So from that sort of public-facing, public interest perspective, the ICO is saying, well, in the vast majority of instances, this is where they have to spend all the time because this is the thing that's cheesing off the public.
Yeah.
So therefore, given that artificially low cap of 500,000, that's actually sort of the vestigial tale of the old Data Protection Act 1998, because that also had a cap of 500,000 for general data protection breaches. So PECA was originally in line with that. That was then increased in Data Protection Act 2018 to a similar regime of 4%, 17.5 million for data protection breaches. But PECA enforcement, which is actually the thing that browns off the public, remained at 500,000. So the ICO is spending more of its time proportionally on enforcing PECA, but put out loads of these judgments, and then but you only get 500,000, not judgment decisions. Sorry, so put out all these decisions, but the most you get will be 500,000. And then of course not everything is so serious to warrant being at the top of that band. So very often it will be, we've hit these marketers for 250,000, we've hit this organisation for 350,000 because of blah, blah, blah. So the most time-intensive thing was yielding the lowest revenue.
Yeah.
Whereas now they'll be able to fine in the same way that they can when it comes to data protection breaches, and it will be, we'll go from the hundreds of thousands to the millions very rapidly. Still be proportionate. So, a small organisation with a small amount of turnover is only going to be hit for, say, 500,000, 1 million, 1.25 million. They're not suddenly going to face a fine for, 15 million. But it just means that where it is warranted, then suddenly those bigger 5 millions, 10 millions, 15 million fines are in the toolkit available to the ICO. So it's again something that's probably needed tidying up for a long time, but at least the ICO will now feel that they can actually be able to do something that I think that will make a difference to the public if they can potentially reduce the volume of spam that they're getting through these pieces of marketing that ordinarily simply they haven't been punishing people enough for, in fact.
Well, I think that rounds off nicely the kind of business impacting changes and the headlines there. There are a few other additional changes that's probably really useful to be aware of. First of all is the research provisions. And this makes it clearer when and how you can use personal data for the purpose of scientific research. And it clarifies that people can give broad consent to an area of scientific research. And the definition of scientific research in of itself has been widened under the Act to include research that's been described as scientific, irrespective of its funding source and or commercial status. And I think, as I mentioned to you, Peter, this is kind of a reflection of the impact that COVID had and the research that has been done as a result of this. And I think it's going to be very useful, certainly for the future, when we are thinking about perhaps, not that I want to say it, but any other sort of pandemics in the future.
This is designed to help. We've already talked about AI, so I'm not going to sort of regurgitate what we've just said there. We've talked already about some of the things in this bill are designed to hopefully help that element of innovation and fostering that culture. And this is a little bit in the same way. I think you're right to make that reference to sort of pandemics. I think there's stuff in here that helps, for example, the pharmaceutical industry when they're doing trials, when they're looking at research on everything from vaccines to new treatments. Think about how healthcare has been revolutionised just in the last few years, with all the jabs around. I think for the Ozempic and Mounjaro weight loss jabs. Now suddenly loads of people are on those, and then suddenly we're reading, oh, actually there could be issues where people are getting pancreatitis, and so you imagine there being more research carried out on that. It seems to be every day we're reading, oh, actually not only do they help people to manage their appetite, but also it can help if you've got a drink problem, and it reduces that as well. So when we've got sort of medicine now like this, and indeed some of the RNA vaccines that are being developed, because of that pace of change in medicine and pharmacology, you're therefore going to want to carry out more and more detailed studies to see what the impacts of those are on populations. And this is basically trying to sort of say, well, okay, if you're carrying out that research, we don't really want that to be held back or hampered by concerns around data protection. Therefore, if it's scientific, if it's innovative, if it's research, they're wanting to say to organisations that they can hopefully get on and do it.
That leads us very nicely onto my next point then, and that's looking at privacy notices. So the Act updates how you're allowed to reuse people's personal information for scientific research without necessarily giving them a privacy notice if that would involve a disproportionate effort. So again, we're looking at proportionality. And that's provided that you're still doing all that can be expected of you to protect the data subject's rights and explain what is being done with their personal data, i.e. publishing a privacy notice on your website, provided there is still that accessibility there, and if it's not disproportionate to then provide them with an updated privacy policy, they're saying, well, that's actually okay. And that's, again, looking at relaxing those rules.
Yes.
For pretty much the reason you've just explained for scientific research.
Yeah, which makes a lot of sense.
Moving on then to actual ICO reforms. So the ICO will become the Information Commission rather than Information Commissioner's Office, and its structure will change to include board members. And it will also be seeking to lighten its caseload by requiring individuals to seek satisfactory resolutions for their complaints from organisations themselves before they escalate those complaints to the regulator. Because as we've already discussed, Peter, you've said, well, the ICO have got a massive backlog. So they're actually encouraging people to go to the organisations themselves and say, well, actually, I'm really not happy with how you've done this.
Yeah.
I'm not happy, so please tell me how you're going to fix this.
Yeah.
And you're then putting that onus on the organisation.
Yeah, and again, this is something that's there in guidance, but now they're putting it on the face of the bill. So it makes a big difference on that. And for those who previously, the pedants have delighted in terms of, well, where does the apostrophe go on Information Commissioner's Office? That joy has now been lost. It's just the Information Commission. So I think it makes life a lot easier for grammar pedants around the world.
That's very useful for me. I feel like the ICI I can write in my sleep now.
Indeed.
Now, finally, in terms of what we're going to be covering today, we're looking at smart data. This involves companies securely sharing customer data upon the customers or business or consumers' requests with authorized third-party providers who can enhance that customer data with broader contextual business data. A current example of this is looking at open banking. And again, this is looking at that level of innovation when we're data sharing. Peter.
Yeah, so this is just looking at the element of the secure sharing of customer data. A lot of this comes down to open banking, for example, and we've actually worked with clients in the open banking sphere who've been trying to innovate and develop new products and services using things like open banking and innovation in there. We do a lot of work helping clients in, for example, the law tech and legal tech spheres, and a lot of innovation happening in that sort of business support sector is facilitated through things like smart data. And in this, it's basically trying to talking about being able to enhance customer data with the sort of broader contextual business data. And in effect, we're saying that this secure sharing of smart data is being formalized and facilitated through the new act. So again, it's sort of catching up with where business has actually been for some time.
Yeah. I do wish to note that that is kind of the end of the updates that we're going to run through today, but I do note that there are a myriad of others that are buried into the Act, and I'm sure that when necessary we will be covering them in other podcast episodes. But for now, these are the main headline points. I guess what you'll be thinking now is, well, what do we need to do to comply? And, you know, based on all the changes we've made and the conversation we've had today, probably get the gist that a lot of the updates here are looking to relax parts of the existing legislation. And so realistically speaking, there are only going to be small tweaks and updates necessary rather than overhauling existing policies and governance, because the whole point is to relax things, not make it a lot harder for you as an organisation. So kind of examples of this, if we just look at implementing...
Well, I'm just going to stop you there and say, because on here, you very helpfully put together the sort of list of points. We've got sort of 6 different points.
Yes.
So I think let's actually work through. We're going to say the 6 points here that we're recommending you might want to think about. And the first of those is...
Consider implementing a subject access request form to allow data subjects to access their personal data in a way that is freely available to them.
So you may already have a form. We're just saying that in order to comply with this Act, it's now an even better idea than it was before. Having that form to facilitate the provision of that information so that you've then got everything that you need from the data subject. So you aren't left then going, oh, well, can we confirm exactly who you are and what is it you want? Because you've had that nice, clear form in place, hopefully it facilitates just getting on with the request, processing it, getting it done in 30 days.
And it also provides a level of transparency to a data subject. You know, if you're already giving them a tool to say, well, look, if you want access to your data, if you want X, Y, and Z done, well, here it is. You know, it makes for such a more quick and easy and efficient process.
It does. And indeed, we always say as well, that as well as doing that form so that you can request it, you should also have a form that you as the organisation use as like a cover note when you're sending that individual's data back to them.
Yes.
So that should say, you know, this is the data that we've been processing on you, this is who it's been shared with, this is the basis upon which we've done that. And crucially, if you have then had to withhold information or redact information, your form will then say we have redacted because of this. We have we have had to exclude data due to that, and you've been very clear and transparent. And hopefully, now it's not just an exercise in managing sort of the expectations of the data subject. The law is actually saying this is really what you should have. So we're saying make it easy on yourself. Have a form that you use in order to reply to the data subject's request in the first place. So that's our first point.
That's point 1. Point 2. Ensure that when a subject access request has been received, that these are acknowledged within 30 days and responded to with updates without undue delay. Therefore, the data subject is not left scratching around thinking, well, I sent this in, I've not had any updates, no one said anything, have they even received it? No, you're keeping the data subject informed.
Yeah, and I think sometimes organisations get tied up and think, oh, well, we've got 30 days, so we now won't go, having received that request, we will not go back to this individual until we send the information. And then you've got, sometimes for smaller organisations, you're falling over yourselves trying to work out, oh, God, what information are we going to disclose? Oh, can we get information from this system? Oh, that's very, very difficult. Rather than just managing the expectations of the data subject. So this is saying, you know, if you've got to go back and say the update is, we've got that, thank you very much, we'll get back to you on this date. Or if it might be a bit delayed, so look, we might be a bit delayed, we're going to have to extend that a little bit further, this is the reason why. Just managing that, again, will reduce the chance of your data subject saying, I've heard nothing, I'm going to complain.
Yeah.
So
and also then, if you've got a data subject that's, you know, giving you a call or emailing you every day saying, well, what's happening, well, that's also just adding work to yourselves to then keep having to go back and respond. So, you know, again, we're looking to make this a more efficient and easily manageable process. And that leads us on to point 3, where we're looking at reviewing processes around disclosure and ensuring that when exemptions are applied, these are applied appropriately and explained to the data subject. And this goes back to the point you made about almost having a form internally, so that it's very, very clear when you are responding to the data subject what is being done.
Exactly. Rather than thinking knowledge is power, actually sharing this information with the data subject reduces the chance they're going to complain. There's a theme here, which I'm hoping you're all seeing. So that was our third point, point 4.
Next, we're looking at reviewing the types of cookies that are being used and establishing whether these fall under any new classifications that we brought in under kind of filling the gaps of PECA, and looking at where potential consent might not be required.
Indeed, because this has changed a little bit. You know, the cookie law is still there, but this tries to tidy it up a little bit. Increasingly, we're finding that newer websites are using fewer and fewer cookies anyway. So therefore, yeah, you might actually find that you don't therefore need to hit your website users with a great big cumbersome consent form if it turns out that actually this now some of the technology you're using might fall through the actual classifications, so you don't have to have some huge big horrific consent box. Because I still continue to find that it's a pain. I think everyone finds the unintended consequence that these things are a pain to come across.
Yeah.
And depending on the mobile device you're using, it very often even stops you then accessing the website if you can't see the consent or the get rid of cross in the corner, that you can't actually then access the thing you wanted to access in the first place, which is just very frustrating.
Then point 5 on the list is looking at reviewing your use of automated decision making, ensuring that policies are in line with this. If you were once saying, well, we can't do this because of that, well, actually this new act may improve that and may mean that you can do practices that you weren't able to before. So review your policies and look at where amendments can be made.
Exactly.
And then finally, point 6, again, it's looking at reviewing data transfer agreements and establishing whether these fall under the new guidance and how that this may impact relationship and the data that is being transferred with those parties. Because, if they've got materially similar standards and you can clearly demonstrate that, then that may impact the relationship you have with them.
Indeed. And also just, always just check. We talked about adequacy. Has there now, for example, been an adequacy decision from the UK to a country that means that you don't then need to worry about things like standard contractual clauses or other mechanisms? So there's a lot to think about there in terms of that international data transfer piece.
I think to round off this podcast, the main question remaining is, when does it come into force? So the Data Use and Access Act became law on the 19th of June 2025. However, and this is,
the king did sign it. I always now think when he signs something with a pen, and does it actually work, or does the ink flow a bit, and does he swear under his breath as he puts it back on? Because we know he did that when when he became king. So you think, did that happen? But still, that is how things become law. It is signed by the king, and then there's a mixture in terms of how and when this comes into force.
Yes. So, there are parts of the act that will come into force in the next 6 months, and then parts of it that will, take a full year or even maybe longer in some cases. This, unfortunately, is still somewhat up in the air since it only came out at the time of recording a week ago. But I'm sure we'll be able to update you on this in due course.
Yes.
And after, I think this is probably quite a long podcast, this is our kind of last point of discussion. And if you have any questions about what we have talked about today, please email us at admin@digitallawuk.com. And as Peter mentioned at the top of this webinar, we'll be more than happy to circulate a summary of this to you. Please just drop us a line. And if you'd like to hear more from us, including information about subscriber-only podcasts, webinars, and events, then please subscribe to Premium via our Patreon channel using the link in the show notes. A big thank you again to Anson Evaluate for helping to produce this podcast. And if you'd be interested to hear more about Anson Evaluate services, please take a look at the website that you can find at www.ansonevaluate.com. And just a reminder, these episodes are available on our website, YouTube channel, podcast channels such as Spotify, Apple Music, and essentially anywhere you get podcasts from. And please feel free to leave us a review. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you again next week.